Tonight on Ukraine Today, a night of terror, Russia launched a massive missile and drone attack on Ukraine. At least a dozen killed, over 100 injured, heavy destruction. Occupier losses on the battlefield. How many more millions of Russians is Putin willing to sacrifice to keep his bloody war going? A round of nuclear escalation. Russia has created a fresh global threat. What should we prepare for? A separation issue? What did Trump say about Russia on the G7 summit in Canada? Tehran-Moscow road. The new escape plan for Putin's allies. All that and more in Ukraine Today. Hi, we are from Ukraine. I'm Volodymyr Robchun. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's go. Russia attacked Ukraine overnight and early this morning with missiles and drones. At least a dozen killed in Kyiv alone. More than 100 people were injured. 27 locations across the city were hit. Residential buildings, schools, dormitories. Over 1,000 households were left without power. June 18th has been declared a day of mourning in Kyiv. Odessa came under a massive drone attack. Residential buildings and an inclusive center were damaged. At least one person was killed and 17 were injured. In Zaporizhzhia, Russia fired missiles at the residential block and the dormitory. The shockwave shattered windows in over 50 homes. Luckily, there were no injuries reported. Ukrainian air defense shot down 428 out of 472 targets. To attack peaceful Ukrainian cities, Russians are using missiles loaded with metal pellets. That's according to Kyiv mayor Vitaly Klitschko.
Well, here's an interesting find by the State Emergency Service. The police collected these metal balls. This is cluster munition, the inner filling of a rocket. These tiny pellets are designed to cause maximum harm to people. There's no other word for it but genocide. It's about killing as many civilians as possible, using such weapons to strike a peaceful city.
More attacks are coming. The Kremlin is preparing new strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That's according to intelligence reports. Details next.
On the night of June 14th to 15th, the Kremlin carried out the largest missile and drone attack on Kremenchuk. More than 100 Shaheds struck the city in the Poltava region. The strike targeted the energy infrastructure. In the past month, the Russian Federation has used about 2,800 attack drones, nearly 3,000 guided aerial bombs, and 140 missiles of various types against Ukraine. The majority of these strikes are aimed at energy infrastructure, and according to the President of Ukraine, attacks on the energy sector will only increase.
Russia is planning further attacks on the energy sector, which may now be less noticeable to the world due to the focus on the situation in the Middle East. Relevant information is being sought from partners, specifically regarding the Russian threat to the infrastructure of our nuclear generation in Ukraine. The data has been passed on to the Ukrainian energy ministers, the IAEA, and Vitkov. The Minister of Defense of Ukraine has shared the information with his counterpart in the United States.
Volodymyr Zelensky is convinced that no one in Moscow is preparing to end the war or taking diplomacy seriously. The Kremlin has not abandoned its tactic of striking at the energy sector. A large number of Shaheds are intended to wear down Ukraine's air defense. Russia has managed to set up mass production of Iranian drones, and the attacks will only become more massive.
They are reaching a capacity of 700 drones per day and will carry out attacks in waves every 2 or 3 days, with 200, 300 or even 500 drones per day. They will fly in at an altitude of 4 kilometers, where we will not be able to shoot them down with standard air defense systems, and then dive like a hazelnut. In other words, 100 drones means 100 hits. Do you understand what awaits us in September? In September, they will try to create a Shahed Armageddon with Shaheds.
The escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran has also affected the defense of Ukrainian airspace. The US Secretary of Defense announced that in order to protect its military bases in the Middle East, the US is taking part of its air defense systems from Ukraine.
I spent the whole week at hearings in Congress and I was asked, did you really transfer counter UAV systems from Ukraine to the Middle East? I answered, yes, we did transfer them. We are using all available means to protect our people in the region and around the world, because today the defense landscape is different small systems can pose a serious threat.
This is a favorable situation for the Kremlin, which is why the Russian Federation plans to continue striking Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The presidential office is aware of this and is preparing accordingly.
I held a meeting with our military and officials regarding the consequences of the strike on Ukraine's energy sector and the necessary steps to ensure our resilience.
The swift implementation of the 18th package of sanctions and the strengthening of Ukrainian air defense with European weaponry are the steps that can help Ukraine's energy sector survive in the context of the war against Russia.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It really helps. Let's talk numbers. In the past 24 hours alone, Russia lost at least 1,060 soldiers dead or wounded. Since the full-scale invasion began, that's already 1,006,120 Russian troops. Also, in the past day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 1 Russian tank, 3 armored vehicles, 20 artillery systems and dozens more units of enemy military equipment. Putin's invasion has triggered a new nuclear arms race. That's according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Nuclear armed states are modernizing their old arsenals and deploying new systems. Others, who don't have nukes yet, want them. Russia, the terrorist state, is fueling a global security crisis.
The world once again stands on the nuclear brink. A new race for deadly armaments has officially begun. In its annual report, the International Institute CIPRI notes all 9 nuclear powers are actively expanding and modernizing their arsenals. The United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan and North Korea. Israel is also included in this list.
The era of reductions in the number of nuclear weapons in the world, which has lasted since the end of the Cold War, is coming to an end. Instead, we are seeing a clear trend toward the growth of nuclear arsenals, an escalation in nuclear rhetoric, and a rejection of arms control agreements, said Hans Christensen, senior researcher in the CIPRI Weapons of Mass Destruction program and director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Artificial intelligence, cyber weapons, quantum technologies and outer space. All of these can now become part of a nuclear conflict. Not because someone wants it, but because these systems can act faster than a human can understand what is happening. And the numbers speak for themselves. As of January 2025, there are 12,241 nuclear warheads in the world. Of these, almost 4,000 are already deployed on delivery systems and ready for use. And about 90% of this deadly stockpile still belongs to just 2 countries, Russia and the United States. Although their arsenals are not formally increasing, both powers are carrying out large-scale modernization programs. In the coming years, this could lead not only to an increase in numbers, but also to greater technological complexity of nuclear weapons.
This began in 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine. Back then, everyone who was smart already understood that you can't count on anyone. And now the situation is getting even worse, because the issue here is different. That is, if you promise security, then other countries won't have to think about it. But when trust itself and the sense of security are undermined, for example, even with NATO, then of course there will be no trust left in words.
China is also paying special attention to this. The pace at which it is building up its nuclear arsenal is unprecedented. According to CIPRI, since 2023, Beijing has been adding 100 new warheads every year. Already now China has about 600 and it is building hundreds of silos for intercontinental missiles. Experts warn that by the end of the decade, Beijing could reach nuclear parity with Washington and Moscow, and by 2035, increase its arsenal to 1,500 warheads. North Korea is not lagging behind either, albeit on a smaller scale. And in the US, according to analysts, there is growing pressure from the nuclear lobby, which is demanding an increase in the arsenal in response to the Chinese and Russian threats.
We developed the world's first atomic weapon, and that brought World War II closer to an end, saved tens or even hundreds of thousands of American lives, and also allowed us to win the Cold War. A tremendous achievement. Then there was a period lasting 3 decades during which no new nuclear weapons were created, which led to our entire arsenal becoming outdated. Now, we don't need to increase our nuclear stockpiles, but rather to modernize our weapons. We need to make sure that everything is in excellent condition.
Meanwhile, in the terrorist state of Russia, modernization is in full swing. As journalists from Spiegel and Denmark's Denwatch have found, Moscow is reinforcing its missile launch facilities and nuclear weapon storage sites. The media managed to gain access to millions of documents detailing the construction and reinforcement of nuclear storage facilities and launch stations. But despite the ambitions of the Russian program, there are a huge number of problems, failed tests and postponed deadlines, particularly with the Sarmat missile. It is also concerning that the last active treaty between the US and Russia, New START, expires in 2026. And according to CIPRI, neither side has shown any interest in extending it.
For example, countries considered to be threshold states include Japan, Korea, and even Germany, which is now raising the issue of nuclear weapons. Well, it all started with Ukraine. Everyone saw what happens when you give up nuclear weapons and hope for something, you just start getting torn apart. Take Ukraine, for example, they're being torn apart. There's basically no response from the guarantors. But for some reason, no one dares to touch a country like North Korea. But everyone is drawing clear conclusions that you need your own nuclear weapons. And apparently, given how unstable the United States is acting right now, it's becoming obvious to everyone that the only real guarantee of country's security is in fact nuclear weapons.
Now, the world has come right up to a very dangerous line, and if we cross it, the countdown will begin. The very existence of humanity will be at risk. It is time to come to our senses and create a new framework for arms control. But if this is not established in the near future, humanity will once again find itself on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. Only this time in a war that is far less predictable and technologically far more complex.
The US has cancelled planned talks with Russia. That's what the Russian Foreign Ministry claims. The so-called spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, says Washington pulled out of bilateral consultations. And honestly, if that's true, I'm not surprised. What is there to even talk about with Putin's regime? Maybe about surrender, but sadly, not yet. And speaking of Russia, Donald Trump still doesn't seem ready to break up with the Kremlin. Here's what he said on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Canada.
The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in. And I would say that that was a mistake, because I think you wouldn't have a war right now if you had Russia in. And you wouldn't have a war right now if Trump were president 4 years ago. But it didn't work out that way. But it used to be the G8, and now it's, I guess, what's that, 8 years ago, it switched over. They threw Russia out, which I claimed was a very big mistake. Even though I wasn't in politics then, I was very loud about it. It was a mistake in that you spend so much time talking about Russia, and he's no longer at the table. So it makes life more complicated.
Mr. President, sir, Russia was kicked out of the G8 on March 18th, 2014, over 11 years ago. Why? Because 1 month earlier, Russia invaded Ukraine. That's right, Russia started its war while still being part of the G8. They were expelled for unjustified, unprovoked aggression. So no, bringing them back, it was never an option. Looking away from Russia's war crimes, then or now, was an easy mistake. Playing business as usual while people die is a moral failure. Life gets complicated when there's no justice. Help Ukraine get a just peace, and life will get better. Not only for Ukrainians, but also for Americans, for Europeans, and maybe even for some Russians. Though, honestly, I don't care about their comfort. They chose their path. By the way, the President of the United States left the G7 summit early. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the President decided to return home due to events in the Middle East. But here's the thing. Today, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky was scheduled to join the G7 summit, and he was planning to meet with Trump. And now, surprise, surprise, sudden events in the Middle East, which the US president knew about even before they happened. A bit too convenient for a coincidence, and frankly, a bit too cowardly for the leader of the global superpower. That's my opinion. And finally, about Putin's friends. The Iranian regime is reportedly negotiating an escape plan to Russia. According to Western media, several high-ranking Ayatollah allies have received personal security guarantees from top Russian officials. Details in our next story.
They are preparing an escape plan. Iran has begun negotiations with Russia about a possible evacuation.
Everything we do is subordinated to the most important task.
Senior Iranian officials may also join the campaign of the fugitive Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
These are dozens, hundreds, maybe millions, thousands, and millions of people who are carrying out the most important task.
Ali Jazi, who holds the position of Deputy Chief of Staff to Iran's supreme leader, is conducting secret negotiations with representatives of the Russian authorities about the possibility of leaving the country in case the situation deteriorates further. This was reported by Iran International, citing its own sources.
It is reported that other high-ranking Iranian officials have reportedly received similar contacts in recent days, and some of them have already finalized their own escape routes.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated in a recent video address that high-ranking Iranian leaders are packing their bags.
Russia has become quite a popular refuge for all the world's dictators, and it's obvious why this suits Putin. Yes, he is trying to create an image of himself as the last defender of tyrants, and for him this is another opportunity to raise his status among such countries. Well, fortunately, there aren't that many of them left. You can single out North Korea, Iran, Belarus, right? But for the most part, no other political leader would even consider the possibility of seeking refuge in the Russian Federation.
Let us recall that on June 14th, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a phone conversation during which they discussed the hostilities between Iran and Israel. After that, the US president announced his support for Putin's candidacy as a mediator in negotiations between Tehran and Jerusalem.
Putin is trying to use this conflict to boost his standing as a politician with influence on the geopolitical stage. The question is, why is Trump playing this game? And it's obvious that his previous statement about needing 2 or 3 final weeks to make up his mind about Putin and this whole story in which the Kremlin dictator is leading the American president by the nose. But clearly that period has passed without any tangible results. And Trump also continues to flirt with Putin and to build some kind of long-term relationship with him. Here too, we can make an assumption as to why this is happening. Yes, this is actually part of the global confrontation between the US and China.
The operation against Iran began on the night of June 13th. The Israeli authorities explained their actions as an attempt to prevent Tehran from developing nuclear weapons. During the strikes, strategically important targets were hit, including elements of the nuclear infrastructure, and several high-ranking Iranian officials and scientists connected to the atomic program were eliminated. In response to the strikes, Iran launched ballistic missiles at Israel.
We are witnessing a story in which the United States has held several rounds of negotiations, both public and private, with representatives of Iran in order to obtain official confirmation of their renunciation of the nuclear program. This did not happen, but Israel and Netanyahu, in fact, were only pleased and smiled because, firstly, this operation has strengthened Israel's status. Secondly, it has significantly shaken the Ayatollah regime itself.
At the same time, the United States forbade Israel from killing Ali Khamenei, who is the religious leader in Iran. This was reported by Reuters, citing 2 American officials who spoke on condition of anonymity. It is reported that the veto on eliminating the Iranian leader was personally imposed by Donald Trump.
How events will unfold from here is quite difficult to predict at this point. But the fact that Iran itself, in principle, is ready to abandon any of its nuclear ambitions in exchange for retaining power is an obvious point. What remains unclear is the future behavior of Israel and its allies regarding either the elimination of this regime or the preservation of the new status quo, which would further strengthen Israel's position as the leader of the region. And indeed, when talking about the operation itself, it is important to emphasize how systematically and step by step Israel's idea of countering Iran was implemented.
Previously, the US and Iran held 5 rounds of negotiations on the nuclear program. The 6th round of talks was scheduled to take place on June 15th. However, the negotiations were cancelled due to the escalation of the conflict between Iran and Israel.
That's all for today. Thank you for being with us. We read your comments and we feel your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you next time.